Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My brother wrecked my car, then leaned back with that smug grin that has followed me since childhood and said, "You'll forgive me. Mom and Dad will see to it." The words hung in the air like stale smoke, heavy with the assumption that the rules would bend for him the way they always did. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't even let my hands tremble as I stood there looking at the crumpled front end of the only car I had worked myself half to death to afford. I just nodded, lips pressed tight, while he gave a careless shrug and wandered off to joke with a friend on his phone. He didn't even notice how still I went. He had no clue that I wasn't going to swallow this one. He had no clue that something had already shifted inside me. The car wasn't just a machine for me. It was my freedom, my independence, and in a way, my proof that I could take care of myself without leaning on the endless safety net our parents strung beneath him. I bought it after years of double shifts and side gigs, the kind of work that made my hands ache and my back throb, the kind of work my brother had never once touched. He always had another excuse, another laugh, another out. And now here I was, staring at twisted metal because he decided his night out was more important than basic responsibility. The cops didn't even bother asking whose fault it was. He admitted it right away but laughed like it was a joke. A fender bender for him was nothing but an inconvenience he could charm his way out of. When my parents showed up, their reaction was predictable in its script. Mom immediately asked if he was okay, brushing her hand down his arm as though he had survived a near-death event instead of scraping up the car he had borrowed without asking. Dad shook his head and muttered something about kids these days, though my brother was well into his 30s and had been calling himself between jobs for the better part of a decade. Then they turned to me. Not to apologize for his recklessness, not to ask what the car meant to me, but to tell me to be the bigger person. They said it the same way they always did, like I was a machine built to absorb every one of his mistakes so he could stay the golden boy. I stood there in the cool night air, headlights from passing cars flashing across the wreckage, and I realized something that almost made me laugh. They weren't going to change. My brother wasn't going to change. And maybe I didn't need them to, because unlike him, I had something they couldn't touch. I had patience. I had silence. And I had paperwork. I let the whole thing play out exactly as they wanted. I drove the car home, hood bent, engine whining like it was begging for mercy. My brother strutted inside and poured himself a drink, announcing he'd make it up to me by paying for pizza. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. I smiled, sat down at the table, and ate that greasy slice like nothing in the world was wrong. He thought the silence meant surrender. He thought he'd won again. But after everyone went to bed, I pulled out the insurance file I kept in the drawer by my desk. I'd signed those forms carefully, had asked the questions no one thought I paid attention to, had made sure every detail was in order. My brother never cared about the fine print, never cared about anything that didn't shine in the moment. That night I read every page again, my fingers tracing the words that confirmed what I already suspected. His laughter, his arrogance, his blind faith that our parents would always shield him, it was about to collide with something harder than my car's front bumper. The next morning, over coffee, Mom told me I shouldn't hold a grudge. Dad chimed in with his usual, "Family's all we've got." My brother walked in late, still smelling of beer, and patted me on the head like I was a child, telling me I'd get over it. I smiled again, a slow, patient smile that none of them recognized. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't even mention the call I'd placed the night before to my insurance agent. Because this time I wasn't just swallowing another one of his disasters. This time I was building something brick by brick in the quiet. And I knew exactly how and when I was going to let him see it. As he lounged on the couch, laughing at his own joke, I looked at him and thought about how fragile his confidence really was, how brittle the smirk became when faced with anything he couldn't charm his way out of. He thought this was over, thought Mom and Dad's shield was still enough to cover him. But I had already started the clock ticking on something he couldn't run from. And as the sound of his laughter filled the house, I felt the first taste of satisfaction I had known in years. Because he didn't see it coming, not even a little. In the days after the crash, I let the house settle back into its usual rhythm of selective concern and elastic memory, because I knew the only way to touch the nerve that had never been touched in my brother was to work in that unlit hallway where bills, policies, and signatures live. So I made coffee strong enough to peel paint and open the folder that has quietly grown heavier with every year I've been told to be the bigger person, and I started lining up proof like dominoes, the photo of the front end crushed into a bad origami swan, the timestamp text where he wrote that he took the car, relax, the police incident number the officer read to me while my brother cracked jokes about airbags, the dashcam clip of him rolling a stop sign he swears he respects, and the thin yellow carbon copy from last spring when I made him sign the named driver exclusion, so my premiums would not be dragged down by his record that he insists is spotless, because in our family we treat history like a whiteboard. What no one in my house remembers, including my brother who remembers only the parts that flatter him, is that last year when the policy was up for renewal, I held the kitchen hostage with a stack of papers and asked him to sign the form that would exclude him from coverage on my car unless I granted written permission for a specific date. And he mocked me for being dramatic but signed because he wanted to get back to a game, and my mother said I was creating trouble where none exists, and my father folded the mail while humming and changed the subject to barbecue, and I slipped that form into a plastic sleeve and filed it behind the title, because I have learned that in this family love is a wind, but paper is a wall. So when my brother laughed about pizza and told me I would get over it, I did the small, unglamorous work of gathering things that don't look like weapons until the moment they land. And I called my agent and described the wreck in the calm voice I use when training new hires, and I asked her to pull the endorsement and confirm my brother's status under the policy, and she whistled under her breath, a delicate little sound, and said she would open the claim, attach the exclusion, and initiate subrogation directly against him, which is a bureaucratic word, but to me sounded like a door finally clicking shut. I hate that I know the vocabulary of consequences while my brother knows only the vocabulary of excuses, yet there I was, writing a summary email that laid out every fact without a single cheap adjective. Because facts are explosives that do not need gasoline, and then I sent the dashcam clip and the screenshot of his text and the signed exclusion with the shaky signature he always says looks cool, and I copied none of my family, and I said nothing out loud. And for once I let stillness be the loudest thing in the room. They filled the stillness with the usual script. My mother stopped by my room and advised me not to poison the well with legal nonsense because we are family, and my father recommended that I look at the big picture, where cars are replaceable and people are not, and my brother floated through like a sitcom he had already seen, tossing out a lazy apology that was really a dare, tossing out a promise to Venmo something when he got paid, which in his calendar falls right after never, and I sat there nodding, unmoved, because the big picture finally included a frame none of them chose. A small part of me kept asking whether I was escalating, whether the rational thing would be to bargain for a few $100 and a mumbled sorry, whether I was turning into the kind of person who wins arguments by paperwork rather than conversation. Then I remembered how many times I have been sent to clean up nonsense behind him while being told that cleaning up nonsense is noble, and I realized that what I was really doing was refusing to be the family's soft landing, which is not unkindness, but a basic refusal to keep paying the toll for a bridge I did not build. I allowed myself one tiny, private laugh, the kind that shakes out of you when a long, slow plan finally has a pulse, and for dessert I performed my first small act of revenge that would not make headlines, but would sting exactly where he keeps his pride. Because I logged into the household auto-renewal portal my parents never touch, and, using the authority my father granted me years ago when he declared I was the organized one, I created a separate driver profile for my brother and attached the accident documentation and the violation points the officer mentioned would post in a few weeks, ensuring that when his next application for that dirt-cheap weekend rental he loves hits the system, the rate will spike like a thermometer in July. And he will blame bad luck, and I will smile like a saint on a greeting card while saying nothing at all. The envelope from the insurer arrived on the third day, as if delivered by a stagehand who understood timing, heavy with that serious paper stock that smells like a courthouse. And inside was the confirmation that the claim had been accepted under collision for my vehicle and flagged as non-permissive use for him based on the exclusion and his own text, which meant the repairs would proceed for me and the bill would follow him like a stray dog he couldn't shake, and I slipped the packet into my bag next to the signed exclusion, and I checked the calendar, because the family dinner that was supposed to celebrate my mother's gratitude month was scheduled for Saturday, and I suddenly felt the hum of a stage just before the curtains lift. I zipped the bag, made a list, and let the house keep believing that nothing was happening, while the table was already set for something none of them were prepared to swallow, and when my brother whistled down the hallway asking who wanted tacos, I answered in a voice smooth enough to skate on that I would bring something better to the table on Saturday. Then I closed my door and pressed the insurance packet flat with both hands, feeling the weight of my quiet like a tool I finally knew how to use, as outside the day slid into a soft evening that looked, to anyone glancing through the window, perfectly calm. On Friday morning, with the house smelling faintly of the cinnamon candles my mother buys in bulk every gratitude month, and with my brother humming that same off-key tune he uses to pretend he is unbothered by anything sharper than a dull spoon, I took the insurance packet out of my bag and added 3 more pieces to the quiet machine I had built, because I have learned that revenge, when it is clean, rarely announces itself with a drumroll, but rather with forms that arrive on time, calls returned before lunch, and signatures that do not shake. So I drove to the collision center recommended by my agent, approved a full teardown that would document every hidden fracture the impact had carved into the frame, and authorized storage from day one, which meant the meter would tick in small but relentless increments that would roll, like pebbles in a jar, into something my brother could no longer wave away with a pizza coupon and a grin. While the manager took photographs and wrote estimates in a neat hand that looked like it belonged to someone who never forgets a deadline, I stepped outside and called the state accident reporting line, because our officer had filed his report, but there is also, tucked into the fine print that my brother treats like a superstition, a requirement that the driver at fault submit proof of financial responsibility or accept the chain of consequences that begins with a letter and ends with a suspension, and I asked for the correct form, gave the incident number, confirmed delivery by email and mail, and felt a still, settled satisfaction bloom in my chest. Not because I enjoy wrecking someone's day, but because I have carried too many days wrecked by someone else's. I didn't think that counted. The second call was to the rental desk where, for years, my brother had charmed his way into weekend convertibles with coupons and a wink, and although I did not sabotage anything illegal or whisper untruths, I did ask a patient employee to attach a notation that the primary policy for the damaged vehicle would not extend to any temporary vehicle issued to the at-fault driver under my name, which is a dry way of saying that if he attempted to slide into a shiny toy while the wrecked car sat silent and opened like a patient on a table, the computer would hold up a palm and say try again, and if he wanted to try again he would do it with his own policy, his own deposit, and his own newly expensive rate. At home my mother called out from the dining room that she had found the linen napkins, which means she expects peace at any cost, while my father asked whether I could bring a green salad because it keeps the peace, and my brother, breezing through the kitchen with a mug he never washes, announced that he would forgive me for being moody after the crash and suggested I pick up a cheesecake to smooth things over, and I nodded with such easy politeness that even I almost believed I was done. But I am a woman who has learned to keep one more move tucked in the hem, so before I went to the grocery store I sat at my desk, pulled up the email from the insurer confirming subrogation against him, printed 2 copies on that serious paper that feels like it can hold its own spine, and slid each into a plain envelope with his name written in my careful, schoolteacher script that he has mocked since we were kids because legibility, in our family, is mistaken for showing off. There is a voice that still lives somewhere in my ribs that asks whether this is too much, whether I am punishing a man who will never learn by making him pay a bill he will only resent, whether I am swapping one kind of dysfunction for another. And I listened to that voice without fighting it, then answered it honestly that I was not weaponizing pain but returning it to the address that kept forwarding it to me, and I promised myself that if he took responsibility even once, even in part, I would meet him halfway across the table like an adult, but until then I would let the cost of his behavior ride on his own back instead of mine. The afternoon stretched itself thin and bright as I shopped for romaine and parsley and lemons, and I laughed a little in the produce aisle at the strange relief of buying herbs while my plan marched forward without any more pushing, because momentum, once it is real, feels like a river that has finally found its slope, and when I came home my mother had set the table with the good plates and the old silver, and had placed a tiny gratitude card at each seat, the kind that asks you to write one blessed thing, and I slipped an envelope under my brother's card where only he would feel it when he sat, and then I moved around the room arranging chairs and straightening knives the way I always do when chaos is pretending to be order. He arrived last, of course, and he wore the loose smile of a man convinced the world is a mattress and he is permanently falling. And he clapped my father on the back and kissed my mother's cheek and made a joke about how I had better not be dramatic tonight because he was in the mood for peace. And then he dropped into his chair and his hand brushed the envelope and he paused, puzzled, before tucking it beneath his plate as though my name on paper were an old bit of homework, and I poured water for everyone and sat down and met his eyes just long enough to let him see nothing at all, and the quiet that followed hung for a beat like a held breath before the conversation stumbled forward about harmless things. Under the clink of forks and the soft murmur of my parents trying to keep everything light, the phone in my brother's pocket buzzed with the first automated notice that his rental club had adjusted his profile and would require a deposit that starts with a number he likes to pretend does not exist in his checking account. And the buzz made him glance down and frown, and I speared a leaf of romaine, lifted it to my mouth, and chewed with a calm that felt almost indecent, because for once the consequences were arriving at the right door, and I had not even opened my envelope yet. The one with the accident report acknowledgement and the neat list of dates that would, if ignored, turn his license into a souvenir. By the time the roasted chicken reached the center of the table and the candles had softened everyone's faces into a picture my mother would have framed if she could freeze the world precisely at the moment before truth arrives, I had already decided that I would not let the evening dissolve into the usual soup of gentle lectures and strategic amnesia. So when my brother made his tired little toast about family sticking together and winked at me as if we shared some private joke where my car happened to be the punchline, I took a slow drink of water, set my glass down with care, reached into my bag, and drew out the envelope that held the bones of everything he had refused to carry. Then, without ceremony, I slid the insurance report across the linen to him, the paper gliding silently as a blade through cream, and for a heartbeat no one understood what they were seeing because for years words had solved every problem and paper had only decorated birthdays. He touched the corner as if it might be hot, flipped it open with that bored flourish he uses to signal he is above consequence, skimmed the first page as if it were junk mail, then stopped hard on the section that spelled his name in unambiguous letters beside the phrase "at fault driver" with non-permissive use attached, which is not poetry, but maybe the most beautiful sentence I have ever read, because it meant the repairs for my car were covered and the insurer would come to him for every dollar he thought he could outrun, and I watched the color drain from his face the way light slips when a cloud takes the sun, leaving him pale and childhood small in a chair that suddenly looked too large for his posture. And he lifted his eyes to me with something like confusion and something like betrayal, which was almost funny given that I had been the faithful archivist of his messes for years while he curated his innocence like a museum brochure. My mother reached for the paper with a soft, frantic sound, the same sound she used when I was little and fell off a swing, as if the document might be bleeding, and my father cleared his throat and asked, in that careful tone reserved for stubborn dogs and delicate negotiations, whether this was really necessary, whether we might not handle it in the family, that overworked phrase that once meant safety but had, over the decades, been stretched thin until it meant a silent subsidy for one man's carelessness and a polite gag for everyone else, and I looked at both of them with a calm that surprised me and said I had already handled it in the family by cleaning up until there was nothing left of me on the days he burned through. and that this time the consequences had been redirected to the person who had earned them, which, to my ear, sounded less like revenge and more like accounting. My brother tried to recover his swagger with a grin that used to get him out of parking tickets and school detentions, muttering that I must have misunderstood the policy, that the agent surely made a mistake, that he always had permission because we were family and family does not police keys, and he reached for a familiar escape route, promising to pay me back in installments that would start when his next big job materialized, then pivoted to appeal through my parents by arguing that I was being dramatic, that I was humiliating him on a night meant for gratitude, that I was turning a fender bender into a courtroom. Yet the more he talked, the more the facts lay there like stones across a shallow stream, easy to step on if you chose not to look away. And the more the room filled with the quiet embarrassment of people who have watched someone skate and are finally seeing the thinness of the ice. I said, gently because I was done with the performance of anger, that there was nothing dramatic in a signed exclusion he himself had initialed, nothing theatrical about a state requirement to report proof of financial responsibility. Nothing malicious in forwarding his own text where he announced that he took my car and told me to relax, and I told him that if he wanted the theater to end, he could start by acknowledging the part where he starred, then shoulder the bill like an adult and stop laundering his risks through the people who love him, which is love's fastest path to rot, and for a long stretch no one spoke, the kind of silence that makes silverware look accusatory, until my mother whispered that surely we could undo the claim. And I met her eyes and said not this time. He rifled the rest of the packet, hands a little shaky, until he found the letterhead that spelled out subrogation, the estimate totals that would climb as soon as the body shop finished the teardown, the storage charges that ticked like a metronome. And then he hit the enclosure that referenced the state notice already en route to him about the accident report he needed to file by a date that was not far away, a deadline that would, if ignored, tug at his license, and I watched the calculation shudder across his face as he realized that charm would not persuade a database and that my patience had finally been replaced by process, which does not blush or bargain. My father asked how we could fix this without lawyers and letters, and I answered that we already had a fix, that the fix was consequences, and the result would either be responsibility or the correction he had avoided since high school. And my brother's laugh came out clipped and thin as he said I was enjoying this, and perhaps a part of me was, not the pain exactly but the clarity, because there is a relief in living without the weight of someone else's unpaid tab pressing into your ribs, and I told him that if he wanted a path that did not hurt, he could choose it by calling the insurer in the morning, setting up his payment plan, arranging his own rental under his own policy, and returning the keys he had treated like toys without asking. And I would be fully satisfied to let the rest of it fade into the background hum of adulthood. The candles sputtered a little as if even the wicks were nervous, and for a moment I saw us from above, a family portrait that had skipped the glossy touch-ups, each of us exposed in the role we had rehearsed for years, and I understood that my final move, the one I had kept folded at the bottom of my bag, would be the only language he might respect because it would slice through the last soft landing he counted on. So I reached again, slowly so no one flinched, and placed the second envelope on his plate, this one thicker, this one carrying a copy of the driver exclusion with his shaky signature and a short, simple cover note naming the date, the time, and the store camera that watched him take the keys. Because the market on the corner records everything and a polite records request is a marvelous antidote to selective memory, and while he stared at it as if it might detonate, I smiled without sweetness and asked whether anyone wanted coffee. And he finally whispered, hoarse and small, "What did you do?" And I told him that he would understand by morning when the phone started ringing. Morning arrived like a verdict delivered by sunlight, sharp and indifferent, and while my mother clattered pans with a brittle cheerfulness that always means she is trying to glue the air back together, my brother trudged down the hallway with the expression of a man who has finally met the hallway's end and discovered there is no secret door, because his phone had already sung its hard little songs through dawn. First with a message from the insurer confirming initiation of recovery against him with a neat schedule of expected charges that read like the price tag on arrogance. Then with a notice from the rental program informing him that the club he once charmed with winks and small talk would be delighted to hand him keys only after a deposit large enough to scare the jokes out of his mouth and a rate adjusted to reflect the history he had sworn did not exist, and finally, like a drumbeat that refused to miss a step, with the state reminder regarding his accident report deadline, written in bureaucratic calm that nevertheless carries the quiet promise of a suspended license if ignored, and he stood in the kitchen with all of this in his hands as though the messages were a bird that had fallen from the sky and refused to fly again. I poured coffee without offering sympathy and without showing glee, because I wanted neither performance and because the truth, at last, did not need my face to do its work. Then I set the cup by his elbow and said only that paperwork moves whether we argue with it or not, that repair shops bill whether we debate their existence or not, that responsibility lands whether we believe in it or not. And he looked at me with something like fear and something like relief, as if a part of him had always wanted the floor to stop tilting even if it meant he would fall, and he asked in a low voice whether I would call the agent and undo what I had done, whether I would tell our parents I had overreacted, whether I would help him navigate this mess. A word that in our family is a synonym for carry, and I told him calmly that there was nothing to undo and that I would not call on his behalf, and that navigating, in the adult world, often involves reading the map you were given and following the road you chose. My mother tried a last appeal to the softness she has always managed to cultivate in me, reminding me of birthdays where my brother made us laugh, of late-night drives where he picked the music and insisted we were fine, of the way family is supposed to hold one another when the world is unkind, and I listened because I refused to become the kind of person who cannot hear love even when it arrives carrying a demand. Then I answered that love is not a discount code for bad behavior and that kindness is not the same as erasure, and I promised that I would show up to the repair shop to sign my own documents, that I would keep my own appointments with the agent, and that if my brother wanted company while he called to set up his payment plan, I would sit in the next room and make tea, not as his secretary, not as his savior, but as his sister who is finally refusing to be his cover. He did not call that morning, and I did not force him, because consequences do not work as vitamins slipped into orange juice, they work as a mirror kept at eye level until the viewer blinks first. So I left the house and walked to the small market on the corner where the clerk who knows everyone greeted me by name and handed over the formal DVD containing the camera footage already copied for the insurer, a dull silver circle that contained, without commentary, the brief clip of my brother pocketing my keys with that careless swing of his wrist that used to pass for charm, and I slid the disc into a protective sleeve and placed it in my bag beside the signed exclusion and the dashcam drive. Not because I craved more ammunition, but because I have learned that thoroughness is its own kind of mercy, since it ends arguments before they drag everyone into the river. By afternoon, my father had retreated to the garage to sand a piece of wood that did not need sanding, a family signal for helplessness, and my mother had gone quiet in that wounding way where she peels vegetables as though they have offended the family name. And my brother sat at the table with his phone face down and his jaw locked, and I stood in the doorway long enough for all of us to understand that this was the room we had built together, one favor at a time, one excused mess at a time, one erased boundary at a time, and I said that I would be leaving in 10 minutes to meet the adjuster at the collision center, and that I would appreciate a ride since my car was still in pieces, and my brother looked up with a flash of old reflex, the one that offers help as performance rather than as responsibility. Then, after a long pause that felt like the peel of a stubborn label finally coming loose, he took his keys and said he would drive me. The ride passed through a landscape that had not changed, but felt entirely different. The sun warm on the dashboard, the air carrying that faint scent of oil and early autumn, and he gripped the wheel with both hands and asked, in a voice that sounded like the boy he had been before everyone decided he was made of gold, whether this would ruin him, whether he would ever be able to climb out, whether I would ever forgive him, and I told him the truth I had avoided for years, which is that I am not interested in ruin or in heroics or in staged forgiveness, that I am interested in a life where I am not constantly repositioned as the cushion at the bottom of his falls. That I am interested in a family where apologies are not currency but commitments, and that I do not know whether he will climb out because climbing is a verb and verbs belong to the person who uses them. In the shop office, the adjuster reviewed the teardown notes with professional disinterest, which is its own kind of mercy, and scheduled the next steps while my brother stared at the estimate, as if numbers could be negotiated by tone. And when we walked back to the car, he exhaled a breath he had been holding since last night and said he would make the calls, that he would set the plan, that he would handle the state notice, and I nodded without congratulations, because adulthood is not a ribbon ceremony. Then I thanked him for the ride and closed the door and watched him sit there for a beat with his forehead against the wheel as though listening for instructions from a machine that could no longer be charmed into giving him a pass. Weeks later, when the car returned with a fresh paint smell that felt like a new paragraph rather than a rewrite, the bills continued their quiet march toward my brother, and my parents learned to speak to both of us without holding their breath. And the house adjusted to a gravity that felt less pretend, yet every so often I would catch a glance between my parents that asked whether I had gone too far and a glance from my brother that asked whether I would ever turn back, and on certain evenings, while the neighborhood settled around us with the small sounds of dishes and television and dogs tugging at leashes, I would hold those questions and resist answering them even to myself, because part of justice is letting the story keep some of its mystery. And because I cannot yet decide whether I finally stepped out of a role that was crushing me or whether I simply wrote a better script for the same old play, and the truth, which I have learned to respect even when it refuses to comfort, is that I might not know the difference until much later when there is no audience at all and no applause to mistake for peace.